And that was never the goal of an intersectional framework. It was not to say that because I know your race and class and gender, that I therefore know your subjectivity, right? That I know who you are as a subject and an agent in the world, right? So intersectionality actually has real problems when it works as an account of identity. And when in the ensuing decades since 1989, when we came to have that term, which named has become a sort of umbrella term to name a whole body of literature that existed in the decades prior to it. The Combahee River Collective talked about the simultaneity of oppressions. Black women in the 1940s in the country talked about the double handicap of race and sex. Black women in the 1890s in the United States talked about the race problem and the woman question, right? And so there has been language pretty much in every century and every decade where Black people have had access to struggle on behalf of Black freedom and freedom for Black women, that there has been an attempt to actually name and to try to think about these things together. None of that has been about a desire to wholly articulate Black women's individual identities. Rather, all of those have been attempts to account for the way that racism, sexism, and classism in particular, and then later heterosexism, ableism, nationalism, etc., have had negative impacts on Black women's life chances and chances to thrive. So racism, sexism, and classism are distinctly different words than race and class and gender. But very often when we use terms like I'm an intersectional feminist or we do intersectional feminism here, what that can then mean is that we are just name checking identities across a range and saying that we are engaged in the process of intersectionality. The problem with that is that to treat intersectionality as an account of identity is to share the framework of its radical potential and make it easily co-optable for neoliberal aims. If intersectionality is an account of power, then when you say that you're doing intersectional work, you are explicitly, continually naming and calling out the way that systems of power work to wall Black women and Black communities out of opportunities. If you're merely saying that you're intersectional because you're aware of the range of diverse identities and the fact that there is no singular Black experience or singular experience of being a woman or singular experience of being a femme or singular experience of being a queer or trans person or singular experience of being a Caribbean person or a person from the United States, right? If that is the way that you primarily think about the intersectional project, well, corporations have no problem taking that up, right? Naming diversity as a value, there is a whole body of literature that makes the case that diversity is good for people's bottom line. And folks certainly like to have a pop of color, and put us in the photo op, right? Or to say that they're doing Black feminist work across transnational contexts. And so, you just have Black women from different countries, but that doesn't mean that we have actually gotten to the substance or the structure of how these systems of power actually shape our lives. Intersectionality has radical potential both as an analytic framework to help us to do our research and to meet the needs of our communities, and as a framework that reminds us over and over again that we're battling against systems of power. We would be doing real harm if what we conceded was that we were really just talking about, workshops about our different kinds of identities and, who we are and our different experiences. That's not a way that we actually challenge white supremacy, that we challenge coloniality, that we challenge the operations of capitalism. And in fact, if we're not careful, we can be saying that we're doing intersectional work while really reinforcing the very systems that intersectionality is designed to be an analytic to expose their operations, right? And so one of the reasons that I feel so vehement about this is because in the last couple of decades, there has been a movement afoot among some US-based academics to say that we need to move beyond intersectionality and we need to adopt other frameworks, right? And because intersectionality cannot do all of the labor that we intend for it to do, because it has been co-opted by the sort of neoliberal dictates of the US university, etc. And my response back to that work is to say the kind of intersectionality that is about us sitting around having workshops about the differences in our identities has absolutely been co-opted by a neoliberal corporatized university structure. But the kind of intersectionality that Kimberlé Crenshaw was talking about in 1989, which asks us to think about the fact that if you are undocumented and you are coming home to a dude that is violent with you, how do you then go to the authorities to protect yourself when you are dealing with a context of violence, but you are also in a precarious position as a citizen, just as one example, right? And so that becomes a situation where violence begins to intersect in your life in ways that do not provide you protection. Or what does it mean if you are working in a company where they are discriminating against you specifically because you are a Black woman, not because you are merely a woman, not because you are merely a Black person, but because you are sitting at the intersection of those two things. And so in the 1980s, a lot of that work was around companies that had policies that discriminated against women who rocked braids or women who rocked dreadlocks, right? And so they weren't coming after, at that time, it wasn't standard for men in corporate America to wear those kinds of styles. And so they weren't coming after Black men, right? And they weren't coming after all women. They were coming specifically after the cultural practices of Black women, and the law had no remedy for those problems, right? Because it talked about women as a class that could be discriminated against. It talked about Black people as a class that could be discriminated against. And it had no way to think about Black women as sitting at the intersection of these systems of power. And so that is the conundrum that Kimberlé Crenshaw was trying to name and trying to get at. She wasn't trying to say, look how unique Black women are at the intersection of our race and our gender, right? Those are really different projects. So the second thing that it becomes really necessary to say on our way to talking about the June Jordan essay that's structuring our thinking tonight is that Patricia Hill Collins, who is perhaps my most favorite, but not really. I mean, there's so many greatest hits when it comes to Black feminist thinkers, but she is one of my North Stars. And Patricia Hill Collins has a new book out. She sneaked a book that I didn't know was coming called Lethal Intersections that came out last fall. And in that book, she is very concerned with this idea that we should begin to think about violence itself as intersectional, right? And part of the way that she goes about making this argument is to remind us that in the two essays that Kimberlé Crenshaw writes in 1989 and 1991, demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex and then mapping the margins, those two essays, which are canonical essays in Black feminist thought, that one of the primary structuring problems that Crenshaw is trying to respond to is to make visible and then resist the operations of violence. It's not just about identity. And in fact, in Mapping the Margins, Kimberlé Crenshaw says, look, intersectionality is not some new totalising theory of identity. She specifically says this to us, and she says it to us more than nearly 35 years ago. And yet somehow the way that this has proceeded along is for us to be like, well, if we can just name all the categories, then we'll understand. And this is why people have a bunch of feelings when you don't name their category when you're doing the litany. So you've noticed in this conversation how I keep saying race and gender and class and age and ability and sexuality and religion and nation, right? There's this proliferation of categories that begins to matter if what you're trying to do is get at identity. We have less anxiety about the proliferation of categories if what we're trying to do is get a precise accounting of power. It doesn't mean that we need less categories. It means that we turn to the categories that will become most useful in our particular context for getting at and understanding oppression, right? And those categories might actually shift depending on your context. This is the thing that US Black people really struggle with because our context is one where Black and white race relations structure every feature of our lives. But when we travel to the Caribbean or we travel to the African continent, where we're in places where these are Black countries where Black people run things, right? Those analytics begin to shift a bit. And so then it becomes about class, it becomes about region, it sometimes can become about skin tone in ways that are different from what happens in the US, right? And so we struggle to map these frameworks on because yes, white supremacy matters in a US context, and it certainly matters in global context, but in global context, where you're talking about decolonial struggles like, becoming less British or less French, right? Or literally breaking away and having a war that breaks you away from, from colonial control. That isn't the story of Black identity in the US. Yes, we're in a colonial context, right? But the actual day-to-day materiality of what that colonization looks like is really different if you're talking about African and Caribbean context versus the US. And then race begins to take on a really different valence. Conversely, when folks then immigrate to the US and those distinctions really matter for them, so a lot of times when Caribbean and African folks come to the US and we just have a category called Black here, right? And folks are like, well, but I don't identify with those Blacks, right? I identify with these Blacks. And we're like, well, and all the time, you'll just see US Black people say, when the cops come, it does not matter what your accent is and whether Puerto Rican or Dominican or Antiguan or Barbudan or Bajan or Trinidadian or Jamaican, they just are like Black, and so that slipperiness is a thing that can disrupt our ability to have real conversations about what Black feminism looks like in multiple contexts. For me, I am from the US Deep South, like the place where all of the civil rights struggles that are kind of iconic, where, we get Jim Crow, where that's just a part of life, right? Where people went to segregated high schools and where there were colored fountains and that sort of thing, right? That's the US I'm from. So I didn't learn, honestly, about all of this sort of diversity in Black life until I went to college. And then I went to Howard University and I met Black people from all over the world. And it had not occurred to me, for instance, beyond watching terrible Steven Seagal movies in the 1990s that oh, right, okay. I had seen Jamaicans on the TV, never met Jamaican people. I had met a few people from Nigeria because we have a university nearby where there are lots of professors from Nigeria. But beyond that, I didn't have any sense of global Blackness, right? So all of us are coming to this idea of what we think Black means, of what we think race means, of what we think race and class mean together, and of how those things operate, and then trying to build movements because we are still somehow, despite our own distinctions and diversity, often at odds with one another. So, if intersectionality is an analytic frame that is designed to make visible the operations of violence and then to create a context where we can resist that violence, then part of what Collins' new argument in her newer book is that violence is also intersectional because systems of power are reinforced through violence. And getting at this problem of violence in this moment where there is a global push to reinforce, to use violence to reinforce prior systems of power that we had been making cracks in and actually seeming to transform. And so you're seeing the kinds of violence be reperpetrated and reinforced in massive numbers because violence is itself an intersectional project, and intersectionality as a project is designed to make us think about violence. And that's why it sounds frivolous for us to be talking primarily about identity. And so Collins says, violence is widespread precisely because it has been and remains essential to upholding power relations and pervasive social inequalities. Violence is an essential tool of political domination, a situation in which one actor or group of actors imposes his, her, or their will on others. Crenshaw is often acknowledged as naming intersectionality as a construct, yet, Collins says, the significance of resisting violence as the immediate catalyst for her analysis drops away within the subsequent use of the term, especially within academic settings, right? And these become questions about, like, in the US, if your dude is being violent, and I think a lot about the problem of violence because I grew up with a parent who was violent and a violent abuser and who struggled with addiction, right? And so in that time frame, we just called the police because there was a different sort of mode of policing in my small town in that moment. Today, to call the police might have a very different valence, right? What does it mean for an abolitionist project? Is an abolitionist project a thing that actually, it is at the core of so much US organizing because carcerality shapes so much of Black life in the US context, but is abolition a framework while at the core of radical US based organizing that actually makes sense in all frameworks, right? If you're in Haiti and the powers that be just open the prisons and let folks run rampant, right? Is that, like, what does that then mean, right? What does that mean for an abolitionist framework? What does that mean for a carceral, an anti-carceral kind of formulation of Black feminist thinking, right? And more specifically, what does that mean when it comes to protecting women and femmes against the problem of violence, which is always a core sort of investment in thinking about Black feminist thought. So, what I thought we would do tonight is to talk about June Jordan's important essay, and I think understudied essay, Report from the Bahamas. And some context for that essay is really important. It is written in 1982, which is to say that it is written before the term intersectionality comes into existence. It is written, June Jordan has enjoyed the kind of attention she deserves in this moment because she is really one of the foremost Black feminist writers thinking about the problem of Palestine across her corpus of work. And so she has been taken up as a radical Black feminist who thinks deeply transnationally. She is, her parents are Caribbean, but she, lived and worked and taught in New York City. And so you get a little bit of that slippage even in this essay where it's clear that she primarily sees herself as Black American traveling to this Caribbean context, traveling to this Bahamian context, right? And part of the thing that I wanted to think about in this essay was that one of the challenges of even this notion of intersectionality is that it really has become an easy academic umbrella term for a range of really complex kinds of thought that Black women are doing for decades prior to Crenshaw naming this term. And in fact, Crenshaw is naming intersectionality for the Legal Academy because she's reading, and if you look at her footnotes, she's reading Black feminists talking about race and class and gender together. And so this essay really indexes this earlier moment where you can see the terms being used, but the shifts that Crenshaw will make are not yet there, right? And so that becomes really important. And so in this essay, it's actually a pullback in the sense that June Jordan is thinking about the politics of identity. She is thinking about what our identities as offered to us by these systems of power mean for our ability to have transnational solidarity. And she says really clearly that she is concerned with whether race, class, and gender as a framework of shared identity is an apt basis for political solidarity. And that raises really important questions, I think, for the project of Black feminism, which assumes a shared level of experience or assumes that there is a shared language that we can all kind of rally around or that would bring us together. But what happens at the fractures, right? How do we name and crystallize this language in a way that allows us to let intersectionality or frameworks that are under this broader rubric of intersectionality work in our particular context and also create the basis for a strong and also nimble and elastic and wide-ranging transnational Black feminist project? So June Jordan basically begins this by telling a story, right, of being in a hotel in the Bahamas on Easter weekend, and Olive is her maid. And so she encounters this black woman who is in a very different social position than she is. June Jordan is a professor and a writer, incredibly well respected and out on a vacation weekend. And here she is during doing tourist shit in the Caribbean, in the ways that folks in the U.S. like to go and do. And look, those of us who are mildly aware of ourselves, and I do try to be aware of myself, right? Know that people hate seeing people from the U.S. coming. And if we don't know it, we should know it because we can be arrogant. We're just, we just, there's a way that growing up the heart of empire, like, look, there's a whole, sort of mental form of decolonization that has to happen when you grow up hearing propaganda like this is the best country on the planet. And then you travel to other countries that are more beautiful with better food, different infrastructure. And you're like, well, is it better? And how is it better? And all of the things. And so for me, one of the places that this happens is that as a college student, I did a study abroad for a summer at UE Mona in Jamaica, in Kingston. And our professors were really not impressed with we Americans. And they were, frankly, kind of contemptuous. And so they would be talking to us contemptibly about ourselves. And we were all like, but we're black though. They don't treat us well in America. Right. And so there was my first sort of lesson in the ways that we can go. Like, the thing that you learn when you're a Black American is that you're never more American than when you leave America. And then all of a sudden you're very American, right? People perceive you in this way. They perceive you as having particular privileges. And you also have a bunch of really oftentimes fucked up assumptions about what should be happening in other places, right? And so I want to name that as like a perspectival limitation of this. And so we watch June Jordan attempting to go into this context and to try to think reflexively. Now, one very funny question that we could ask ourselves is, I'm gonna say it in my Southern parlance because it's the best language I have. Is Olive even studying this lady? Like, does she actually regard her with the left? Like, June Jordan assumes that this woman is like deeply regarding her in a way that Olive is like, I mean, what's distinctive about you, right, among all these other tourists who are here, taking my time up and being entitled and needing things and being mildly disrespectful. So that's one thought, right? Is, are people as actually interested in Black Americans and our power and wealth and whatever as we tend to think they are? Well, it's a question. However, she says, so I pulled quotes that just that I would find interesting. And so there's an imagined conversation that June Jordan has with Olive the maid, as she is rendered in the essay. And so she imagines that she's asking Olive about her context. And then Olive was like, well, why did you come here without a husband? I was like, this must be 1982, because who's asking questions about that other than the aunties at family reunions and like the Korean spot that I go to? Like, transnational aunties do be asking you about why you don't have a husband or a boyfriend. But beyond that, I don't know why Olive the maid would be doing that with June Jordan. But June says, I cannot imagine how I would begin to answer her. And later she says, my quote unquote rights and my freedom and my desire and a slew of other new world values, what would they sound like to this Black woman described on the card atop my hotel bureau as Olive the maid? Whose rights, whose freedom, whose desire? And then she says, and I think this is correct, and why would she give a shit about mine unless I do something for real about hers, right? And so those concepts that she is thinking about, this notion of rights, right? What is freedom? And this notion of desire. Part of what Jordan is responding to is a discourse in the 1980s where essentially, transnational feminists are saying back to US based feminists and white feminists, like, hey, y'all are deeply obsessed with desire and like orgasms, but some of us are actually obsessed with getting everyday needs met, right? Schooling, clean water, food, housing insecurity, things of this nature. And so this kind of Western obsession with pleasure and desire and orgasms is like not at the core of feminist movements in every context. Today, I hope that it has more, I mean, I am a Western feminist in that way because I care a lot about pleasure and desire, but I don't want to overlay those concerns onto a transnational feminist project. And so I'm offering these to you as provocations about what does freedom mean and what happens if what is freedom for you runs up against what is freedom for me. For instance, I'm going to say a thing that's slightly spicy, but I hope y'all have figured out by now that I'm kind of spicy. In the US, Sarah and I have talked about this, right? Because I mean, y'all see the shit show that is going to be our election season. Oh my God, are we going to make it? What is going to happen? It's not clear. But one of the questions becomes when we as Black feminists try to have a commitment to transnational solidarity, right? And that to me means a deep commitment to Palestinian freedom, right? A deep commitment to saying, I don't want to be a part of the US funded, backed, supported, orchestrated genocide happening in Palestine, right? That is a Black feminist position. It is just a human position. At the same time, I look at the choices. And I say, well, one man presided over a pandemic in the US that killed hundreds of thousands of Black people, hundreds of thousands of people. We lost 1 million people, many of them Black and indigenous, because he decided that in a necropolitical sense, that the people that were dying from the pandemic in 2020 were not white and able-bodied. And so we could just, go slow. What does one do with the death dealing politics on one side, right? If you're Black in the US context, so you are in an empire that acts evilly around the world, and you have deep dissents with the way that US empire facilitates a context of death in all kinds of places, and certainly throughout the Caribbean, Nicaragua, Grenada, Haiti, etc., on and on and on, right? US military interest, Cuba, right, have facilitated Black death. And, you're like, well, but if we vote for that other guy, right, then that would also potentially be death at our doorstep. So which thing is it, right? What happens when your immediate need for material sustenance runs up against this long range need or set of commitments to transnational solidarity? Like I'm not offering you any answers to those things. I'm saying that those are questions that we have to sit in the tensions with, that we're all being asked to negotiate. What does a radical liberatory politics require of us? And how do we negotiate that also at the level of our material needs and the basis of these systems? And what happens when those things are in direct conflict, right? And so that is one of the questions that June Jordan asked, and essentially says, like, what happens if I'm a monster in her dreams? And what happens if she's a monster in mine? Like, then what are we supposed to do? So that's the piece around June Jordan a bit, is that she is asking us to think. Let me go back one slide. She is asking us to, nope, that was not what I wanted to do. Let's try again. All right, there we go. She is asking us to think about whether or not shared identity is the basis for solidarity, right? But at the same time, she is also reminding us that misery is not the basis for a progressive politics. Now, I don't think June Jordan would say that Black identity or being a woman or even being poor or working class are forms of misery. But the precarity produced at the intersection of those identities and at the nexus of those identities is not necessarily the thing that is going to allow us to have good relations with one another, right? And that's a question that intersectionality, as the framework that gets named later, is actually politically not necessarily interested in, right? It's one of the sort of cascading questions that comes out of intersectionality. Intersectionality is like, look, hey, here are these systems. This is how they show up. This is what they do. But it doesn't actually have an answer, I don't think, as an analytic frame for how we then navigate the set of social relations that tethers us together, even though we might have different reactions to these particular systems, right? So the person who helped me to then think about what that might mean is Audre Lorde, who in her essay Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger says, as Black women, we have shared so many similar experiences. Why doesn't this commonality bring us closer together instead of setting us at each other's throats with weapons well honed by familiarity? Because what you see June Jordan doing in Report from the Bahamas is essentially saying that she is not going to assume automatically shared solidarity over the chasm of nation, over the chasm of class, over the chasm of the fact that as a tourist, she might be participating in an economy that actually exploits this worker, right? Yes. Was that it? Okay, I thought I had one more slide. So, I will stop there because I have talked a lot, and ask us to just begin to engage what, I, so I have some questions, and those questions have to do with what intersectionality means to you in your particular context. Do you think that there is a basis for transnational solidarity? And then that around these sort of shared identity concepts, and what might that look like? And and then when I make this turn to anger at the end, part of it is because I'm always interested in Black women and the question of anger and all of the ways that it shows up, and I write about this and think about this. And I care a lot about it because I largely think that, you know, Black women are the people the world has charged to figure it out, and if we can't figure it out, then this shit is gonna go to hell. And so our relationality and our ability to figure out like a relational politics with each other is really critical to forging a new world. Like I think that is just what's true. It feels what's true to me. But that means that there's an affective life to intersectional structures, right? There is an affective and there's a set of there's a relationality begotten by the ways that these systems of power interact, by that is begotten by the identities that these systems and structures bequeath to us, that we have to grapple with, and struggle together about. So those are my provocations and thoughts at this moment. So yeah, let's chat. Tell me what's up, what y'all want to say. I'm gonna look at the chat and I'm gonna let Sarah tell me what happens now.
All right, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Everybody, please give Dr. Cooper a round of applause. That was really deeply insightful. I always love and appreciate your provocations. And so, yes, it's up to us now to turn on our cameras if we are able to, and let's start talking about what intersectionality means to you in the context of Dr. Cooper's presentation and the readings that we got intimate with in the lead up to this teaching. So anybody can unmute if you want to raise your hand. We have a question from Paulette. Paulette, you can unmute.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna be quick because I'm on babysitting duty tonight, so I gotta go watch my nephew. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Thank you guys for organizing this. Dr. Cooper, this is really amazing because your book got me through my thesis. That was a rough one. And I think for me it was really interesting how intersectionality itself was presented in this way. Because I think you're absolutely correct. You know, we've seen, I, in my opinion, something that we've created then be used against us to benefit others. If that's the right way of saying it. And I think for how I first came across intersectionality. I was like, oh, this is such, you know, in the Black feminist theory, this is massive, and this is allowing a lot of things to be explained, and why I think as a Black woman from the Caribbean with a disability, I face these challenges. But it goes further than that. And reading the reading by June, I think that was interesting, being, you know, being from the Caribbean and an island that relies highly on the terrorism, but tourism, and how I've had this theory for a very long time that particularly white people, when they come to the country, they're like reliving slavery days because of how they talk to the people who work in the hotels, or the expectations they have. And we are constantly in a wave of servitude because we depend on their dollars. And to see how a Black woman thinks that she isn't, you know, she's here to enjoy, she's here to appreciate it, but how is another Black woman who has to serve her seeing her? Is it seeing her as her equal? What is her issue? And I would like to believe that sometimes when we come across Black tourists, we're like, okay, you know that when you're here, you're Black like us, but there's always difference in terms of your class and what you're experiencing when you enter our island. So yeah, I really appreciate going down this rabbit hole of intersectionality. It's like a new layer for me. So yes, thank you. Thanks very much.
And it's not just white people who travel to the Caribbean and then want to relive some weird class politics. It's like there are also copious stories of Black folks traveling to the Caribbean and getting to enact a certain kind of Americanness, right? That they actually don't get to live out here all the time. And so there is this sort of performance of class hierarchy that I think if we're going to have an honest conversation, part of what it means to be intersectional and to really exist with these concepts is to think about what it means to decenter US based feminisms. And look, that is hard for me because I am like, very much in the US context, always wanting to say to the US, think about Black people. Like, what are you talking about? You want Black women to do all this labor. But when we're thinking about transnational Black feminisms, because US based work has enjoyed so much prominence, part of what the reason that Intersect Antigua is so important is because it is helping to expand this, the body of literature we have. I mean, we have literature from all over the world where Black women are thinking and talking about gender politics and patriarchy, but certainly it pales in comparison at the level of volume to what is coming out of the US context. And that has to change, right? So that we can actually have a more robust understanding of our own condition. And that requires those of us in the US to have a little bit of humility about the ways that the colonizer lives in us, and the ways that when we get to go to these contexts where folks, because of their participation in a service economy that the US has enforced through its economic agendas around the world, that our desire to be served, as opposed to building a world where folks are where we have care economies that all of us participate in, that we extract from and we also give to, is a way that we can reinforce the sort of politics of coloniality, and a way that we need to think far more robustly about what we're doing. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that comment. Patrice, you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. What I was thinking when I was reading the essay and also as a part of this conversation was about the key to transnational feminisms, transnational Black feminisms, is being aware of how at some moments you are the oppressed and then at other moments you are the oppressor. And some people are not comfortable with that shift in identity. So if you're Black American and you are existing in a white supremacist country, you will be the oppressed. if you move into another space where you have significant geopolitical power and privilege, then you may well have to start grappling with the fact that in this moment, with the level of privilege you have in this hotel and in this space, you are a representation of the oppressor. And it felt to me like if June Jordan was having a lot of trouble with that, with recognizing the depth of that identity and how to navigate wearing that, because the way she operated to me reminded me very much of white women with that awkward tight smile of wanting to be liked and wanting to be perceived well. So she's recognizing that, hey, I view myself in a particular way. I probably view myself as social justice oriented, egalitarian. All of those things are things that I hold so firmly about my identity. But yet I am in a space where a person might very well and very rightly perceive me as the thing I hate most in my context, might perceive me as the privileged, might perceive me as the oppressor. So what do I do with that? And it seems like if her attempt was to be palatable, to be one of the good ones, that I'm not like that. You know, I'm nice to my maid. I'm not that person. But invariably, in trying to not be that person, you end up being that person. Because to not be that person is the one who admits that, hey, I am that person. In this very context, I am that person. I am a person with privilege. I am a person that may very well be um, contributing to a socioeconomic system that oppresses this woman. And if she looks at me and she sees an obnoxious tourist, a potential oppressor, well, I just need to sit with the discomfort of that. Doing that is what makes you not that person. But the essay elements of it, it felt like she was trying hard to be likable. And I feel like if this is a battle that comes up quite often in transnational Black feminist organizing, where people who are very rightly oppressed in one situation are unable to see, recognize, grapple with the fact that in another shifting lens from a different geopolitical perspective, they might well be the ones with the privilege. And I've seen it happen, for example, in Barbados in the Caribbean, when we've had, like during the pandemic, where we had nurses come from African countries and they received treatment that was not the best in some areas. And so when they talked about not being welcome in some areas by Caribbean people, I even felt within myself the immediate defensiveness, like to go say, oh, I have an African friend, but who does that sound like, right? So it's in that moment that I recognize that geopolitically, when it comes to a Barbadian passport, when it comes to the Caribbean region, there are some privileges that we have. So not clinging to that identity, that fixed identity as oppressed, which is a very real and true identity for a Black Caribbean woman, but that in other spaces, my passport will give me power and privilege. So if a person from another Black country says, well, hey, you access spaces that I do not, to not be the white person in the scenario, essentially. And I feel like if June Jordan has some trouble not being the white person in the scenario.
Do you feel like she is? See, okay. I want to acknowledge that I feel some things when you say that, because I am like, Black women are never the white people in the scenario. I take ish. I get you, and I might therefore be doing the very American thing you're talking about. So I want to name and own that, and also say, do you actually think that white women have this level of reflexivity though? That like June Jordan has? Because I felt like she was deeply reflexive and was like, she might be my monster, I might be her monster. Like, I I guess I'm wondering if the
I
discomfort
don't,
is
I don't think,
discrediting in it
sorry,
of its.
go ahead,
No, no,
sorry.
no, yeah. No, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't think there was the level of reflexivity, but even the things that you even named at the beginning, like assuming that Olive is studying her that sort of way, like assuming that she is seen as gluttonous by the people in the restaurant, wanting to be perceived positively. In a situation, even the saying that she's my monster and I am hers, that's giving it goes both ways, which it doesn't. when you're coming from a place of significant privilege. You can be her monster, but if she's your monster, she's your monster because she threatens your self-concept and your self-perception, not your material living. So there were elements in that she was just seeming so concerned about how she was viewed that it felt eerily familiar in a way that white women would do so much to be perceived as not racist, other than actually not be racist. Not that they're the same, but there were some echoes of that hit me like, huh, yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Tell before you go, I had the same feelings as you did when I was reading, especially when she made that both sides, it goes both ways comment. And then I was also wondering, to what extent is she aware of the irony of, what she's saying? Like, is she levying a critique of herself in this way by presenting herself in this very unflattering way? I think that she's, aware of like the obnoxiousness of, the turns of phrase and everything else that she is writing down on the page. And so, yeah, I felt like there was a level of like self-critique that was like very subtle in her like presenting herself and presenting this sort of like binary opposition between herself and other people. And then I was wondering if even when she said that, she might be my monster, I might be her monster, perhaps like it was more a critique of essentialism, against essentialism, that there are different multiply oppressed people, and that at different points in history there have been people who have been oppressed who then went on to oppress. And so that's that intra-categorical complexity within like race and gender and class. And so perhaps it's less, oh, she is just as powerful or powerless as me, and more, we all have the potential to cause harm depending on the material conditions and historical context in which we find ourselves. That was my like reading, but that's, we can have multiple interpretations, but I just want to validate how you felt. And I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Tell.
Can y'all hear me? Okay. So you mentioned like connecting to anger, and so there's like rage points coming up in my mind when it comes to intersectionality. And what you mentioned just now, Sarah, like the idea of how like we have the power to enact harm on each other, it really connects with me. Because I'm thinking like of during COVID, when prices for flights was going down, and Black Americans were taking the opportunity to travel all over the Caribbean and possibly translating death to countries that couldn't handle it. And, currently I had something recent happen with my parents who still live in St. Croix. They live in the Virgin Islands, which the health infrastructure isn't there. And so when my father like lost his eyesight randomly one day, he had to come take a emergency flight to Florida to get like treatment. And then my mother, like who had to get surgery, had to come to the States to get it. And they're now racked, with the finances of it. And so like the pain of that is really bothersome to me. So like, yeah, COVID, and I also see it like with people talking about braids and like, oh, braids are cheaper in the continent. So let me just go there and exploit that as a way of like embracing this soft life or luxury that within US Black feminisms is a point that they are clinging onto now, of like I deserve the right to a soft life. I deserve the right to luxury, which emboldens and makes me deserve to exploit people who are not my Black peoples. They're separate. they are the practitioners or the maids to give me the luxury I deserve. And so that has come up for me in this conversation, because I was born and raised in the Virgin Islands, born and raised in St. Croix. I moved to the States. I moved to Atlanta to go to college. I went to my first year of college in St. Croix, and I was studying for political science, but I wanted to study gender studies. And also when I was in political science, the professor outed me as queer because he kept asking me, like, don't you want to get married? And I kept telling him no. And then he finally clicked in front of the entire class, why am I not? So that was annoying. And so I moved here. And I'm thankful for getting intersectionality from US Black feminisms. And I'm so thankful to have learned from Southern Black women who I was surrounded by, also decolonial feminisms. So I got the language and the insight from people based in the South who are globally aware of what the framework can be. And I've seen it over the years, just in 2015 when I came here, how intersectionality has shifted to an identity-based understanding, which I never got the flares of anger that told me something wasn't adding up, especially as a queer Black woman who, on your island, being queer meant you were anti-Black nation building with heterosexism. But identity can't tell you that, because it's other Black people and you're a Black queer woman. So, okay, +1, Black woman, Black people, minus the addition and subtraction that identity-based intersectionality gives doesn't explain to you how heterosexism is a part of coloniality. And so it doesn't give you the pain, or it doesn't give you the language for the pain of what that is. And so when you see like heterosexism and white supremacy as being this interlocked thing, it then answers why Black people see you as such a villain to their own nation building. And especially like, again, in college, when Maria and Irma came, even with my own Caribbean peoples, who are first and second generation Caribbean people who were in the Caribbean student associations with me, love to talk about, roti, let's talk about calypso, because they were using that as a way to cling to an identity that they felt distant from, which I think we also have to have conversations about how we, within diaspora, try to claim a descent because we think that that is the more Black one. That's a whole other conversation. But like, when I was having conversations with people that I thought were in the walk with me about all of this, and then when Hurricane Maria and Irma came and I couldn't talk to my family for weeks, and I didn't know if they were okay, and they're not there, because you just wanted to talk about rice and peas and have oxtail conversations and talk about calypso and go about carnival because that's fun for you to play in it. But when like I'm telling you, hey, I don't know how to contact my peoples, you're gone. It feels again what the Caribbean always feels of, like I'm just a plaything. Virgin Islands is called America's paradise. We're just playthings. And identity-based politics doesn't answer like what it means to feel like a plaything. Yeah, so I just shared my anger. Hope that made sense.
Oh, you made the most sense. You made the most sense. And this thing you said about being structurally produced as the plaything, right? As the expendable thing, as Toni Morrison has this concept of playing in the dark, where she talks about white people just want to, play around in Black identity, but it's like another version of that kind of colonial fantasy around, yeah. And I particularly appreciate the critiques of soft life thinking because I have felt conflicted about it in the sense that I watched the girls, right, all say like, we're living the soft life. And I actually was like, I'm gonna let Black girls rock on this because life be hard like as fuck, and so okay, and then then some of the young women that I was giving talks at the time that the term sort of explodes, saying like it's deeply capitalist and it's all about this kind of thing, and I was like, well, let's. But what I hadn't considered was the transnational aspect of it. So I was like, look, if you want to like go get your nails done and lay in for the day, like I don't care, but you're right that if it's like, oh, we can just run through Caribbean countries for cheap and exploit people and then say that we're living the soft life, that's actually not, that's actually deeply exploitative and problematic. And so how do like I think that there's a need for a concept of like soft life thinking. Although, interestingly, isn't that Nigerian influencers that sort of come up with that term and then it gets adopted around? Like, I think it's Nigerian folk who sort of invent the term the soft life, because I've done a little research about it for the book I'm writing. And then it sort of gets taken up in the US context, right? So that's all very interesting. So I think like, I like soft life as a corrective to the strong Black woman shit. Like I like the like idea that like if soft life is we get to be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm mad, and hey, you did me wrong, and like, hey, I'm not gonna hold all this shit with me, that's cool. If it's like we're gonna, socioeconomically, geopolitically exploit vulnerable places so we can feel like a flex, now you have me thinking, sis. And so now I might have to go back and be like, y'all can't have that either. No soft life for you. Like, you know what I mean? Because not at that, it's like because that's our critique of white feminists, is them being like, we wanted jobs in the 60s. And Black women are like, we've always had jobs. We've had jobs. So, so if, so I hear you. I hear you. What does it mean to be framed as the people who produce and create luxury for other folks? That's a problem. Yeah.
That was great. Gabby?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope you are all doing well and your loved ones are okay in the midst of the aftermath of Beryl, which is wreaking so much havoc. But one thing I wanted to add to this conversation is, what does it mean to root intersectionality and coalition in spirituality? I'm thinking along the lines of Africana religious studies. And a key term that always comes to mind is sacred relationality. So what does it mean that the divine in me honors the divine in you, for example? And how coalition might become possible in these situations because we all acknowledge that we all are sacred, in a sense, and how that can kind of help us create and bring forth better worlds where we're not, I feel like saying leveling the play field is a little irresponsible, but a world where we can all be considered fully human, be considered sacred. And I'm also thinking as well in terms of what does it mean to root coalition in radical vulnerability and honesty? So very much how this conversation has been going, right? How nuanced it becomes, realizing that in some instances we're privileged, in some instances we're not. And I also think back to the solidarity that happens between, I forgot their names, but in June Jordan's essay, the two students. So I think her name is Kathy, who admits that like her father is an alcoholic.
Right.
And how that one moment of, well, I won't say that one moment, but how that moment of honesty and vulnerability is what kind of sparks that connection between the two. And also what it means to think in terms of sisterhood and not just, yes, thank you for the name drops. Right, and how Kathy and Sikotu become not just comrades, but also sisters. The way that June describes it, like they're walking together, they're hugging, they're talking. Right. And so what it means to think about intersectionality in terms of, I hate to say the word universal because I have a lot of beef with that term, especially coming from a neoliberal point, but what it means to kind of ground ourselves in a I don't know, like a common spiritual vocabulary. And one of the reasons why I also gravitate towards Africana religious studies is because Africana essentially means both the African continent and the African diaspora, which allows us to have conversations about diaspora, like Tel was mentioning. And so what does it mean to diasporically consider intersectionality, not just transnationalism as like these global flows, but also what does it mean to live in diaspora? What does it mean to be obscured by diaspora? What does it mean to be able to move within diaspora or to not be able to move within diaspora? And so these are just kind of some thoughtlets that I'm working through as I'm also considering intersectionality in the backdrop of my own work. But yeah, I think something that I keep coming back to is this idea of sacred relationality, and honoring the sacredness of each other, and not only of each other, but the environments around us, the ecologies around us, all life around us, whether we can see it or not. And I think that also is an important part of our conversation of intersectionality, not only being power against people, but also against the environments that we're in, the animals, the plants, the lives around us. And so yeah, that's just some things I'm thinking through.
I love it, and I wanted to. I'm trying to make sure that I send it to the right thing. There's a really famous essay by a Black woman named Bernice Johnson Reagan, who wrote an essay in the 1980s called "Coalition Politics: Turning the Century." I'm gonna put it in whatever. I sent it to the chat. Hopefully y'all got it. If not, Sarah, find it and send it to the people. It's a PDF, and she talks about this notion of home versus coalition versus solidarity, and gives really important kinds of frameworks for those. But also Crenshaw, in the two original canonical essays on intersectionality, I think in the second essay, I think it's in Mapping, says that all identities are just coalitions, right? All identities. So race is just, solidarities that all of us agree to share with each other that are deeply negotiated, right? These are not natural. These are intentional solidarities that are cultivated, right? And that is her way of thinking about the problem of identity as being seen as essentialist. We just all Black, when we know that what it means to be Black actually shifts in terms of context, right? So even in the framework of intersectionality, this idea that you're getting at that I think is absolutely right, that identities are the basis for coalition. So genders are coalitions, and nations are coalitions, and sexualities are coalitions, right? And so it's that all, that Black people are like, here are the terms that we negotiate together. And even though we don't tend to give ourselves credit for negotiating terms, we tend to be negotiating terms all the time, right? This is when we're having those social media conversations about who can come to the cookout. We're having a negotiation of terms around identity. I imagine that this happens in queer communities. Certainly it happens around categories of womanhood and femme identity. And those negotiations are fraught, particularly when you think about cis and trans women trying to negotiate the terms of womanhood, right? And reproducing problematic power relations. So I think that there's a lot of give and possibility there. The thing I wanted to say is I rock with you on this sort of notion of the sacred. I'm a preacher, so I am religious, and I tend to think that. So I'm not interested in imposing my sort of religious whatever on feminism, and I've had many conflicting thoughts about this over the years. But what I do think in this moment is that what the sacred does is it allows us to recognize that you can't build new worlds without some concept of faith, even if it's a secular conception of faith, right? Even if it's a secular sort of idea about the inherent value of peoples and species and plants and animals and the planet. So it is a Western idea that there is nothing beyond that there's nothing beyond the empirical, right? Black people around the world tend to believe in a deep, rich metaphysics of a spiritual world, however they articulate that, right? That's not about a God concept. That's not about worship. it's about the idea that the world is populated beyond the mere things that we can perceive with the senses. And so reintroducing a notion of the spiritual, I think, is just good for a Black feminism that honors diasporic truths and practices. So I really like the potentiality in that. And, you know, without it having to be a sort of reinforcement of like Christian nationalism or whatever. And I think that that's the thing, is that when you really begin to try to like figure out how Black feminism works as a world building, world making concept, you keep coming back to a notion of the sacred, because I hear you to also be saying something about the fact that part of what it means to have regard for each other is that you have to honor people as having inherent value. And I think that that's correct. And I don't think that all the knowledge systems that exist in the world actually work from that premise. So it might make sense to articulate Black feminism as working from that premise. Yeah.
Okay, we have Bianca and then Nicole. Hello, Nicole. How are you? Okay, Bianca, you can unmute.
Good evening, good evening. I'm gonna give a disclaimer that I am thoroughly confused to a certain extent, but I would be an idiot not to try to like work through the confusion. So basically, I'm a cultural studies student, and I was reading the text for this lecture today, and I got it. Like in theory, I get it. I understand what's happening, but now I'm starting to question, because although I'm in cultural studies, I'm actually looking at Afro-Caribbean art production between 2000 and 2020. And I wanted to use intersectionality as a way to analyze artwork, or to think about all the topics that these artists might be trying to unpack, discuss, rebuke, like all the things. But in the reading of this idea that intersectionality is not about identities is where I get hemmed up. Like I get stuck there, and I'm like, I don't know that I understand that. I do know that historically it is a framework in the legal realm. I totally get that. But I think I've been trying to use it in just other aspects of life. And now I don't know if I'm wrong in trying to do that. And so I'm just trying to get clarity around, is this something that can be applied to a visual art analysis, or should I back up off that approach?
You should not back up. So one, so part of what I'm doing, so one of the extra text there is this text it's just a PDF called Intersectionality. That's an article that I wrote that you can go look at later, where I lay out these debates over the last 3 to 4 decades. And so where I am sort of taking this from, I'm in a debate in particular with a scholar who I consider a friend, named Dr. Jennifer Nash. She teaches at Duke. And she has a really important book called Rethinking Intersectionality. I think I always miss up I can think of the book, I've read the book, but I can never quite remember the title. Jen and I are friends and colleagues, and we have an intellectual disagreement with political implications about how you use the framework of intersectionality. And so Jen wants a more expansive sort of understanding that's rooted in these notions of subjectivity. And also she basically is like, there's just other sort of frameworks that Black women can use. And so much of Black feminism in the US Academy has been reduced to the intervention of intersectionality. So my sort of stridency around saying it's a critique of power, it's not about identity, is really rooted in trying to clarify the stakes of that argument. For you, though, so intersectionality as a framework actually names a whole body of literature that is trying to do various things. And intersectionality gets taken up in different disciplines in different ways. So what Crenshaw says in Mapping the Margins is not that intersectionality has nothing to do with identity. What she says is that intersectionality is not a totalizing account of identity. So remember at the beginning when I was like, I can know all these things about you and know these categories you exist in and still not know you, right? That's what I meant, which is that intersectionality doesn't mean that because I know all your categories that I therefore know you, right? So in the way that we assume that identity can do. But if you look at mapping the margins, Crenshaw makes distinctions between structural identities and political identities. Those are terms that she uses in the essay. And so she says, of course, these systems are implicated in producing particular identity categories, right? And so in that way, you would be well placed to talk about the intersectional nature of our identities, that race and gender are co-produced through a system of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, right? So these systems absolutely produce identities and they put us inside of these identities. That is an intersectional problem. It is a thing that intersectionality can name as one of the ways that those systems of power operate. So if what you're trying to do is get at the complexity of the ways that authors talk about what it means to exist at these intersections of identity, that's perfectly within the realm of something that we would call intersectional. So that's no problem at all. The issue then becomes when folks are like, you know what, I'm an intersectional feminist. So that means that I think, that I'm a Black woman from, a working class, whatever. Intersectionality gets used as a problematic shorthand to index a lot of shit that is not, it is a watered down version of what the deep concepts are meant to do, right? And so that's the thing that we're talking about, which is when you're building movements, it's not enough to say, I've accounted for race and class and gender and sexuality, therefore I have been intersectional. If what you're not doing is also thinking about the operations of power. So when you think about this art, right, are you thinking about the power structures that it is responding to? Right. And what those power structures mean for whether it's the production of the art, whether it's the actual expression that the artist is engaged in, then I'm simply saying that as you think about how to use these analytics, what can't ever fall away is the critique of power. That's it, right? So as long as there is this engagement with power, and not just like this kind of like, look, universities do a thing where they're like, yeah, we need to be intersectional. So what we called intersectionality in the 80s and 90s gets restyled as DEI in the university later, right? Oh, we just need diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops. Everybody come in, tell us your race and class and gender, give us your story. And then the university goes away and they say, see, we're being intersectional, right? And it's like, did you cede power anywhere? Did you talk about the ways that you keep on making Black women mad and killing them because of your processes? Did you talk about the, ways that your advisors in these PhD programs are terrible to Black women and force them to continue to argue for the legitimacy of the kind of projects that they want to do because you actually haven't critiqued the sort of white supremacy at the heart of your own epistemology, right? Like, if you're not doing that, then intersectionality is a word that means nothing, right? Intersectionality means when we admitted people, we made sure that we had a black woman because she ticked 2 boxes, and let her be queer, woo, 3 boxes, and let her be, have a disability, woo, 4 boxes, right? That is the institutional neoliberal co-optation of the logics of intersectionality for ends that are not about what these women are talking about, right? And so that's why you want to be clear that whenever we're talking about it, you can't just talk about identities because universities are like, sure, she took all the boxes. And so we're intersectional. But you can, if you're like, how do these power operations show up so that, to the point of the earlier conversation where I think Tel was saying, it's not just that I'm Black and a woman in a certain space. It's also that I'm a Black queer woman who is seen as an enemy of a kind of Black nationalist world-making project, right? That's a thing about power that is not fully counted for just because, like, we know her identities, but the power piece becomes what about it makes her vulnerable to these systems, right? So part of the thing about intersectionality is that, so in the later debates that happen, one of the things they say is everyone's intersectional. These white boys are intersectional too. Intersectionality is not a race to the bottom. Everybody has a set of intersections that shapes their lives. But the only reason to account for that is to think about how it's either producing privilege or vulnerability, right? That's the reason that you want to account for your positionality within the intersection. Now, the other things that Black people then do, which is to be like, yes, but also because of my position in the intersection, I have a unique point of view. Because of my position at the intersection, look at the kinds of queer Black artistry that we have created at the intersection of these systems of power. Yes, that is the critical and frankly lively remainder of death dealing systems, but it is not but it was not the point of the analytic. The point of the analytic brings you into the room, and then you find out all the other things that are happening there. So if you're using intersectionality as an analytic to bring you into this room where there's all of this complexity in Black art that can be accounted for through these multiple categories, then yes, you're on the right track for sure. It's just about letting people understand that what you're not saying is, I'm just telling y'all to diversify the art world. That's actually not what you're doing, right?
Oh my gosh, that was so brilliant. Thank you so much, Bianca, for your comment, and Dr. Cooper for your response. We're going to take one more question, unless somebody else has a burning question that they need to ask, but we're going to take one more and then we're going to wrap it up. Go ahead, Nicole. Dr. Christian.
Still Nicole. Thank you so very much, Dr. Cooper, for this. I have to tell you that you clarified a lot for me. I will start with an admission that I'm a counselor educator, and I'm also a high school counselor. And in the profession, in the counseling profession, we do the thing with intersectionality that you said not to do. And that is to make, subjectivity and identity primary, as opposed to an analysis of power. And so now I'm left with this nagging question of how did we arrive here? And why are we doing that thing if we're not supposed to be? But I'm also thinking, okay, what do we do now, right? And in the counseling profession, if we analyze systems of power that oppress, what do we do next? And I'm thinking that it really challenges us, the counseling profession, which at least here in the United States is very much rooted in white supremacy. It almost forces us to do something, to become political activists and go beyond just the one-on-one counseling sessions and actually do more to advocate for our clients. And that's not always easy. So it was just more of a statement and a kind of an admission. And I think I have my work cut out for me too. But thank you very much for this. This is great.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Dr. Christian. I appreciate that. And so two things I can offer with that. One is that, so I learned like some years ago, so intersectionality is still making the rounds to the disciplines, right? It sort of comes out of legal studies. It travels through sociology, literary criticism, kind of the humanities disciplines. The first real bodies of literature in psychology that take up intersectionality don't get published till like 2008, which I learned because if I'm not mistaken, which I learned at like one of my professional conferences, because there were like these canonical figures and they were like, these are the big people. And I was like, well, who is that? And, and it was somebody from 2008. And I was like 20 years after the original formulation. So it is already a kind of late framework. It's still really new in the annals of psychology, right? The other thing that I would say to you is, again, like I was saying to Bianca, if you are counseling young Black folks, young people who have not had to think about the ways that the range of identities that they're bringing into the room are structuring their experience, then you are helping them to figure out an account of power, because the minute that they're politicized you're politicizing their identity for them, right? You're helping them to see how existing at the intersections of a range of identities is producing the precarity. So I do a little bit of work with Black girls in high schools, and they all are telling me stories about surveillance and just being talked over. Or like a few months ago, I go to talk to a high school that I go talk at every year. And, you know, one kid, the white boy, wants to debate me about the cops and the police. And what do you mean? Like, maybe we could build a world without police. And the Black girl is there to talk about, like, you know, says to me in the middle of this conversation, can you say more about sexual violence, especially in families? So we know that she's not asking that question other than that it is shown up in her life. And he is talking to me about like these radical ideas I have and how that's blowing his mind, right? So when she said, talk to me about what it means, like, she said, and I came because you were here, so I felt safe to do the thing. So she had talked to me the year prior about the surveillance of the administration with Black girls going to the bathroom and folks just popping in and like looking under the stuff, like, you know, to see if they're there, like all kinds of crazy shit, right? So when you begin to say like, okay, you're Black or you're queer, you have disability, all of these sorts of things, getting them to then name their identities as having some appreciable impact on how they're navigating the school system is a way into helping them see the operations of power. It's not to the side of that thing. It is just that you have to be cognizant that part of what is happening in that moment is that you're showing, and in fact, part of what is then happening, if that's the way that you're counseling or one of the tools you're using, is that when I say intersectionality is about a critique of violence, we're talking about the way that the mental health issues that these kids bring are because of the intersection of their identities, right? Like, it is because they are like, it is true that my identity is Black woman, formerly working class. That is my identity. And it tells me something about the systems that are shaping the kinds of concerns I bring. So when your job is to deal with people at the level of their identity positionality and what that means, it's not anti-intersectional to begin there as a way to help them understand themselves in the broader world. What becomes anti-intersectional is when the folks who are at the heads of the kinds of institutions that reproduce the structures only want to talk about identity and they don't want to talk about power. Right? That's different, right? So Kimberlé Crenshaw was at the fore of helping to platform a lot of the research that Monique Koofson, formerly Morris, did on Push Out, the criminalization of Black girls in schools, that book that it was published under Monique Morris. So Kimberlé Crenshaw has an organization called the African American Policy Forum, and in the mid-2010s, that the African American Policy Forum began on the basis of much of Monique Koofson's work to talk about the problem of the criminalization of Black girls in schools. So much of the work that Monique Koofson has done, she's written several books that are wonderful books for Black girls in high schools to read about these problems, to give them language for, like, they're policing you because of the dress code, they're policing your tone, they're, you know, all of these sorts of things, right? So they're saying your Black girl experience, right, identity category, is being shaped this way because of a bunch of assumptions about what it means to be a Black girl, power structure, you see? So you can be doing both things at the same time. It is that what I'm saying is that we can't become comfortable with the idea that after we have all told an identity story to each other, that we've done the feminist work that the Intersectional Project is about, because that work is actually about then going back to these folks and saying, why are you, let's have some professional education, continuing professional education credits about surveillance and why y'all are, why you think that a Black girl who says something matter-of-factly has an attitude, and what does it mean if she has an attitude, right? That doesn't mean she's being disrespectful. So in other words, it's about then saying to the people who can make decisions, y'all keep treating Black girls like the problems that they present with are problems of a deficiency of identity and not a problem of structures of power showing up in the way that they're responding, right? And so my student who who now works with me, said to me, she was like, she was like, I know that I have anger issues, right? And I was like, do you, or is anger a reasonable response to being surveilled at school? Yes. So they are like, they say identity, Black girls have attitudes. We say, what are you doing to them, right? What are you doing to them? You don't show up here as a Black girl with an attitude. I mean, some of those Instagram memes suggest that Black babies are showing up here already fed up with us. But in general, right, you don't show up as a Black girl with an attitude. That attitude is produced because you keep on encountering structures of power that are designed to like make you not see yourself, not trust your impressions, to tell you that you are a problem, right? And so I told her, and I tell Black girls whenever I go talk to high schools, which is not infrequently, I tell them, oh, they think you're a problem. And the reason I want you to have this language is so you can be a whole problem. Let's be a problem. Like, I want Black girl problems. That's what I want to produce in the world, because everyone thinks we're a problem and then they weaponize the language against us. And so when you're giving folks the language to think about, like we wrote this book for young adults a few years ago called Feminist AF. And one of the things we said in the book to our young people was like, sometimes y'all are mad at your parents because they don't allow, like, this is no whatever for abusive parents, but like you're mad at your parents because like they're a bit more authoritarian. I saw Dr. Denise Davis May in the chat for a bit, and she talks about like like authoritarian parenting structures and how there's some research to suggest that Black parents are more strict and it actually tends to protect Black children, right? So it's like you're mad at this authoritarian structure, or you're mad because your parents have a bunch of kids and you're the oldest and you get parentified and you have to take care of them, right? And what we then said to them was, your frustration is a thing you get to have. But part of what it means to be a feminist is for you to think about why we live in a world where there's not access to public daycare. So then you are the one that has to do the childcare and get parentified, right? So we ask the students, yes, to think about you're the oldest, you're getting, adultified and parentified, and none of that is fair. But that's actually not just a structure your individual parent is reproducing. They are reproducing that structure because of capitalism not making it possible for families to thrive, right? And so it's about being able to give them the language of the power structure, even while they're grappling with what that means for their own intimate context, you see? And so to me, intersectionality does a good meld of those when you don't leave power on the table. When you do, then you don't make the additional pivot, which is to say, yes, you're mad, and I can give you like some DBT techniques or whatever to like manage that. But like, also, it's not wrong that you're mad, because this thing shouldn't be happening. And maybe we can change it, or maybe we can't, but it's okay for us to acknowledge that this thing that is happening is like messed up or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really good. Thanks.
I want to echo what someone said in the chat. This was a whole meal. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Dr. Cooper, for talking about intersectionality, especially Kimberlé Crenshaw's development of the framework as less oriented as a totalising theory of identity and more of an accounting of power and a theory of violence, and for bringing June Jordan's text into the space, both to learn from and critique. I'm personally thinking about everything that was shared, especially in terms of, I mean, I'm going to be writing about this. So this is giving me so much more to think about, particularly how might intersectionality be further complicated when it structurally produces bodies that travel. And so it's not just the theory that travels, but, people who are constituted by different power formations that also move around. And that could include like coloniality, and how might that play into, our earlier conversation about essentialism, when we, of course, we occupy different power positions, but then what happens when, different categories are foregrounded over others? And so citizenship is one huge category of privilege and power, but what does it mean if if I have, you know, a whole ton of class privilege and other forms of privileges, and I move to the US and, you know, I encounter someone who is working class, who, you know, doesn't have a PhD degree, you know, like, and so I feel like that could also be part of what June Jordan might be getting at when she's, you know, talking about what it means for one person to be a monster and that other person is the monster for the other person, but not to discredit those real power positions that are, you know, we can't get away from those at all. So thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please give a round of applause to both yourselves and to Dr. Cooper. You've all been amazing. We've learned so much. Please, Lucia, drop the link to our Instagram in the chat and our website. Lucia also dropped the link to our feedback form. I know people don't like to fill out feedback forms, but they're really, really helpful for us. We want to know what has worked for you in terms of organizing this session, what kinds of future conversations you want to have. We also have an artist in residence program. And so we have a national Antiguan and Barbudan writer who's producing pieces. And so we're going to continue to have these conversations with other professors and teachers and instructors in the future. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. This was incredible, and I'm so glad that it's being recorded. I wish everyone all the best, and we will stay in touch.